Thank you. Please be seated.
In Flanders Fields by John McCrae. In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place. And in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields.
Thank you. Please be seated. Just like to quickly welcome our many guests this morning for this very special occasion, our celebration of Remembrance Day, which is always a very important part of the life of Shawnigan Lake School. It's an event of varied emotions, contrasting emotions, kind of sadness and grief for those who have lost their lives, but also great pride in our country of Canada. And many of you have countries that are like Canada, where many people have fought for freedom and for the public good. And so it's a time for us to come together, especially as Canadians. This is, I always say, high Canadian culture. This is a very important day. People all across the country are doing exactly what we're doing right now. They're taking time to reflect on what it means to be a free people and a proud people, and what it means to work for peace and understanding among nations. So it's a formal event, and I would ask that you not applaud for all the wonderful speeches and music that you're going to hear, but maintain a kind of a formal attitude, if you would, this morning. And we'll continue with the first reading, and I'll invite Georgia Hall, please, to come forward.
A reading from the book of Ecclesiastes. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven. A time to be born, and a time to die. A time to plant, and a time to pluck up that which has been planted. A time to kill, and a time to heal. A time to break down, and a time to build up. A time to weep, and a time to laugh. A time to mourn, and a time to dance. A time to cast away stones, and a time to gather stones together. A time to embrace, and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to get, and a time to lose. A time to keep, and a time to cast away. A time to rend, and a time to sow. A time to keep silence, and a time to speak. A time to love, and a time to hate. A time of war, and a time of peace. The word of the Lord.
Our gradual hymn is number 20 in the hymn book, O Valiant Hearts. Please stand. Thank you all. Please remain standing for the gospel, and I'll invite Nicole Cherry to please come forward to read.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Continue in my love. If you keep my commandments, you shall abide in my love, even as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. These things have I spoken unto you, that my joy might remain in you, and that your joy might be full. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. The Gospel of Christ.
Please be seated. This morning, I'd like to give a reflection on Remembrance Day and its significance here in Canada and at Shawnigan. For those of you unfamiliar with Remembrance Day, which officially takes place on 11th of November each year, it's a memorial day observed in some countries since the end of the First World War to mark the end of hostilities and to remember those who died in the line of duty. It's 101 years to the day since armistice and the end of the First World War. In Canada, it focuses on remembrance for the men and women who have served and continue to serve this country during times of war, conflict, and peace, and those who have lost their lives in the service of peace at home and abroad. I've had a love of war poetry since I was very young. My parents sent their children away to boarding school when we turned 8. We must have been beastly horrors to warrant this exile. My father used to sit on the end of my bed the night before a return to school and read me poems from an anthology of war poems called, rather ominously, Up the Line to Death. They gave me a sense of courage as I headed into a world of dormitory pillow fights and an old-school arena of survival of the fittest. At the start of today's service, you heard Spencer of Lonsdale's read the poem In Flanders Field by Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae, a Canadian medical officer, written in tribute to the death of a friend. His stirring and enduring poem has made the poppy a lasting symbol of self-sacrifice in war. The white flower, Vergiss-mich-nicht, the forget-me-not, is a symbol of remembrance for the German soldiers who lost their lives in the same war. Shawnigan lost 45 alumni and staff in the Second World War. There's a commemorative plaque to my right that marks and honors them. In the aftermath of the war, 43 names were immortalized on the plaque, but at the time, the school was unaware of 2 others, an alumnus and a member of staff who had not returned from the war. The first, John Lander, Old Schoolhouse, came to Shawnigan aged 11. He went on to Shrewsbury School in England, then Trinity College, University of Cambridge, and won a gold medal at the 1928 Summer Olympics in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, as stroke of the Coxless Four. A gunner in the Defense Corps, he was killed in action during the Battle of Hong Kong against the Japanese on Christmas Day, 1941. The second, William Mac McMullen, was a member of the ground staff at Shawnigan from 1927 to 1939. A lieutenant in the artillery, he was killed in the raid on the French port of Dieppe in France on August the 19th, 1942. This term, Miss Dolman, our museum curator, commissioned a new plaque to recognize their sacrifice, and she has been tracking down their relatives in Canada and Britain to let them know about the addition of their names to our chapel. At this point, I'd like to invite Kathleen Hidlay as a representative of John Lander's house. Old Schoolhouse is now Strathcona Lodge Schoolhouse, and the longest-serving member of staff, Scott Noble, Grove's class of 75 and teacher here for 36 years, to come up and formally unveil the new plaque. Only yesterday, we tracked down the email address of John Lander's son, Jerry, who lives in the UK. Proudly remembered, they now take their place in our chapel. Shawnigan alumni represented the Canadian Air Force, Navy, and Army, and served in many of the theatres of war. The faces and names on today's order of service served and were lost in the Atlantic, at Dunkirk and Normandy, in the Middle East, in North Africa and over mainland Europe. There is some corner of a foreign field that is forever Canada. Gareth Cooper and Alex Wallace will read the roll of honour later on in the service. Earlier this term, I received a letter from the Dutch ambassador to Canada. On May the 5th, 2020, the Netherlands will be celebrating the 75th anniversary of its liberation from Nazi oppression. The ambassador wrote that the people of the Netherlands will never forget that 7,600 Canadians gave their lives in the effort to liberate their country. Canada also provided a safe haven for the Dutch royal family. The Canadian Air Force delivered food drops over Nazi-occupied Dutch territory, and in response, Dutch civilians wrote, "Thank you, Canadians," on their rooftops in grateful response. The Dutch royal family has sent Shawnigan 75 tulip bulbs for us to plant this fall so that they flower in the spring at the time of the 75th anniversary of liberation. After the service, we've invited staff members, Mrs. Hamilton, Mrs. Platt, Mr. DeLew, and students of Dutch descent to plant the orange tulip bulbs around our flagpole as a symbol of friendship and renewal. 2 Shawnigan alumni, Flight Lieutenant Peter Reed of Ripley's and Lynx Squadron, and Pilot Officer Stephen Rose of Groves and Hyderabad Squadron, were shot down and killed over the Netherlands. We shall invite the heads of houses of Ripley's and Groves, Owen Bramley and Samantha Lillywhite, to join the tulip planting ceremony at the flagpole directly after the service in order to honour these 2 alumni from their houses. I invite and encourage all of you to take some time to visit the school museum and look into the kaleidoscope of Shawnigan, its history, the people, and the place. The Second World War section is a treasure trove of uniforms, ration cards, gas masks, radios and headsets, pilots' goggles, newspapers, and photographs. I hope that some teachers are taking their classes down to the museum at some point this week. It's a wonderfully unique educational resource for staff and students alike. At the start of this service, we sang the Duxbury House hymn, "I Vow to Thee, My Country." It's my favorite hymn. It's always good to pause to think about the meaning of each hymn we sing. This is a hymn which captures love and loyalty to one's homeland in the first verse, the love that makes undaunted the final sacrifice. But in the second verse guides us, perhaps more importantly, to another country, the kingdom of heaven, whose fortress is a faithful heart. Next time you sing it, look carefully at the lyrics. I rather like the final couplet about heaven. And soul by soul and silently, her shining bounds increase, and her ways are ways of gentleness, and all her paths are peace. For me, Remembrance Day is both a time to honor those men and women, including civilians, who have fallen in conflicts, on whichever side, and also to remind ourselves that we must strive constantly to find those paths of peace.
Good morning. We will be singing a song in Latin, and I just wanted to give you a brief translation. Merciful Jesus, Lamb of God, Father who takes away the sins of the world, grant them rest everlasting.
will rise.
At this time, we remember all those who gave their lives for the cause of freedom and peace. And we especially remember these Shawnigan Lake School old boys and staff who made the ultimate sacrifice. Carlton Allen, T. Norman K. Beard, Richard M. Bell Irving, John P. Bishop, Patrick G. F. Bordillon.
Desmond E. Bradford, James H. Budd, Miles A. Cotton, Charles Piers Davidson, Douglas A. Dawson,
Richard C. Day, Devereaux L.D. DeBrittany, William S. Ferguson, George D. Fix, Thomas M.W. Golby.
Francis B.P. Gregory, Robert W. Harcourt, Cecil W.L. Hulkey, John G.H. Lander, Stuart C. Lane,
John A. Lafergie, John A. Littlewood, William Guy Lockhart, Jeffrey F. Mackey, John F. Mackey.
Colin C. McLaren, Richard Patrick Mingy, John O. Mayer, Samuel V. Jock Martin, Dennis A. Matthews,
John L. McKean, Joseph F. Moore, Michael R. F. Oliver, Kenneth S. Oozler.
James A. Piddington, Peter G. Piddington, Anthony R. Playfair, Peter T. Reed, Stephen G. Rose,
Robert P. Shannon, Richmond D. Ross Starkey Bentz, W. Ludovic Stewart McLeod, George R. A. Walkham, Richard F. Williston, William John McMullen.
A verse from For the Fallen, written by English poet Lawrence Binyon, 1914. They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them. Please be seated. It's a great privilege to welcome 3 generations of the Williamson family to chapel this morning. Commander James Williamson, our guest speaker, Captain Michael Williamson, and Devon Williamson, Shawnigan and Lakes class of 2016. As many of you know, Victoria is the home to Canada's Pacific Naval Fleet. Captain Williamson's last posting in the Navy was as commander of Canadian Forces Base Esquimalt. Welcome this morning.
Remembrance Day is an opportunity for us to honor and remember the men and women who served and who continue to serve in the military in times of peace and conflict. I would like to address 3 points today that relate to the past, the present, and the future. During World War II, 1939 to 1945, over 1 million Canadian men and women fought on land, at sea, and in the air. The war was incredibly destructive, particularly in Europe, and over 100,000 Canadians were injured or killed. You need to remember at that time the whole population of Canada was only 11 million, so almost 1 in 10 Canadians went to war to fight against aggression and to seek lasting peace. This was a significant contribution and was reflected in similar involvement by many other countries on both sides of the conflict. Some of that impact of the war can be related to today. I'm going to ask that anyone in the audience who's 15 years old to raise your hand. Just keep your hand raised for a moment. My father is with us today, sitting in the front row of the chapel. In 1943, when he was 15 years old, the same age as your classmates with their hand raised, he left home, hitchhiked from Ontario to Montreal, and joined the Navy by lying about his age. You can put down your hand. For the next 2 years, he went to sea on several ships, contributing to Canada's efforts during the war. As a member of the Merchant Navy, his ships provided escort duties crossing the Atlantic to the United Kingdom in convoys from Nova Scotia and from Newfoundland, with the threats of collisions, bad weather, mines, and torpedoes from enemy ships and submarines. He was one of the fortunate members of the military, surviving the war, hardship, and other threats. And when he was 17, the war was over, and he returned home to his parents in Ontario. After the war, he went on to serve in the peacetime Royal Canadian Navy, retiring when he was 55. I wanted you to briefly relate on a personal level to the fact that the war impacted many people, and hardships touched those of all ages, including 15-year-olds going to war. I was in the Canadian Navy for a number of decades, largely during peacetime, serving on a number of ships and submarines, retiring 11 years ago. My last responsibility, as you heard, was as base commander of Canadian Forces Base Esquimalt in Victoria. During World War II, a long time before I was there, CFB Esquimalt served as a training and engineering base to support Canada's war efforts. At the start of World War II, Canada had only 11 ships and about 1,700 full-time officers and men. And 6 years later, in 1945, at the end of the war, the Navy had grown to 450 ships and over 97,000 officers and sailors, and this number included both men and women. The Canadian Navy was the third largest Allied Navy at the end of the war. June 25th, 1942, a British ship was torpedoed in the Straits of Juan de Fuca, and the lighthouse at Estevan Point, only 200 kilometers from here, was shelled by an enemy vessel. The war was not something that only happened far away. Today, CFB Esquimalt serves the same purpose, providing a base for training and administration of the men and women in the Royal Canadian Navy, and allowing the ships and submarines of the Royal Canadian Navy to be maintained, repaired, and upgraded to a very high standard of readiness. Members of the Canadian Forces today, the Army, Navy, and Air Force, serve in Canada and around the world, sometimes in dangerous environments with the purpose of defending Canada, its interests and values, and contributing to international peace and security. While Remembrance Day and this ceremony serves the purpose of reflection, honoring, and recollection, it also underpins an opportunity to consider the future, to consider your responsibility and the need for a commitment to several ideals. Many of you are wearing red poppies. The red poppy is a symbol of remembrance. During the First World War, the poppy was the only flower that could grow in the ruined fields of France and Belgium. It self-seeded, so it could continue to grow year after year. Sometimes it was the only spot of color the soldiers saw as the trees and grass were replaced by the shattered trunks and mud of war. We wear poppies on November 11th in memory of the Canadian men and women who served and died for peace and freedom all over the world, and to publicly show our respect for them. Some people wear a white poppy, intended to commemorate civilian casualties and also to reflect a desire for peace. The red and white poppies serve different purposes. One reflects a recognition of sacrifice and hardships and honors veterans like my father, and one reflects a commitment to peaceful resolution of disagreement. Let us reflect instead on your responsibility as citizens of Canada, as citizens of other countries, and as the next generation of leaders and responsible adults. You have a responsibility to honor the contribution and hardships of our veterans, both living and fallen. You have a responsibility to contribute more to your countries and to your societies than you take from them. And you have a responsibility to recognize your own fortunes and advantages and use them in whatever manner necessary to improve peaceful coexistence for all.
I just want to echo the headmaster's thanks for the Williamson family for honoring us with your presence this morning, and especially to you, Michael, for informing and inspiring us with your beautiful words. Thank you so much. I can't remember a finer Remembrance Day speech. Thank you for being here. We will have an offertory, a collection this morning for the local veterans. So please be generous with the collection. Our offertory hymn is number 19, Eternal Father. Please stand. And I'll ask you to remain standing while I invite you to join with me in the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Thank you again for being with us, to all of our guests, and thank you to all those who worked so hard to make this a very special occasion this morning. Our final hymn is Abide With Me, number 52 in the hymnal.